The simplest building you can imagine is actually extremely complicated to build. We went, for example, from modernism, and then we go into industrialism, and then towards the end of the century, there's the postmodernism. Of course, every architect would love the opportunity to go really crazy with innovation and say, like, okay, what if we could do this? And what if we could do that? And it's something that has never been done.
Welcome to Orbital Media. Today we're going to talk about architecture, specifically how to better appreciate and understand it, the nature of different styles of design, how architects think about their work, and also why certain styles proliferate over others. So today I'm joined by Daniela Aveaguera. Daniela, thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
So to kick things off, can you just tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you've done in architecture? Sort of what does your work actually consist of?
I'm originally from Uruguay, so I've then moved to the US, been in New York, in Miami, in LA, and now I'm currently in Basel, Switzerland. So I've practiced in all of this, in these four cities. And I've been involved in actually different types of architecture, I think, or different, it's almost different fields. It's one field is architecture, but in reality, it's so different that it's a different field. But in Miami, I did a bit of just like commercial architecture. Then I did some interior design and hospitality in New York. Then I went to LA to work in like extremely futuristic and powerful architecture, let's say, visually striking. And now I'm in Basel working more with more environmental and site-oriented architecture, let's say.
If you were talking to someone, let's say me, who knows really nothing about the discipline, how would you help someone understand sort of your field of work, what it is that you do as an architect? Like, what do architects do and kind of why do they matter?
Architecture can be so varied that it's almost, you could be able to think that there would be different fields, depending on which type of architecture you do. But I think if you were to really narrow down architecture to its core, to what it is at its core, it's really just a mixture of art, science or engineering, and humanities and people. Because we build for people, right? So at the end of the day, what makes these different, let's say, subfields in architecture is the balance between these three, right? More people focus on the theoretical and art portion of it. Some people focus more on the effectiveness and functionality of it, and some people focus on more the social aspect of it. To me, ideally, it's the more equal the balance, the better. But it's actually very difficult to reach some of these balances. But yeah, I think to narrow it down, it would be basically a mixture of art, science, and humanities.
I want to get into this idea of these terms that some of the terms that you've kind of been using. You just mentioned a couple of categories there, like here are different kinds of categories for how you think about buildings. Can you take us through what those categories are?
You mean the categories like art?
Yes.
Within architecture. Okay, yeah. So, for example, let's say a more art-oriented architecture, I call it more theoretical. Even though all of these terms could be towards a theoretical aspect, but I would say art, it tends to be more academically inclined, theoretical, where architecture it's more about experimenting with, maybe it is about what we think experience could be, like the experience of the building could be, or it could be something more sculptural, looking at architecture as something more sculptural or like a parametric object. For example, Zaha Hadid's first structures, which were very, so that's more sculptural. And then there's the second, let's say, term that I mentioned, the sciences in engineering, is we can also look at architecture as a machine, right? A building, because a building is a machine. Like everything that goes inside the building has to work. There's incredible detail and efficiency built in all of these structures. Um, the simplest building you can imagine is actually extremely complicated. It could be extremely complicated to build if we think of sustainability, or if we think of, for example, seismic resiliency in LA, for buildings in LA or the West Coast area, or hurricanes for places like Miami. So there's a lot of science in architecture. And then there is the part of architecture that is more humanities. And it is the part where we think deeply about the day-to-day user experience. How will someone experience entering the space or the transition to the space? So it's narrating or curating how the user, how we will experience the space. And it takes a lot of understanding of culture, the surroundings of what we're building on, to be able to have a sensible response to it. So that's why I was saying, ideally, architecture should have a very good balance between those three. But again, it's not always. It's actually very difficult to achieve. um, so yeah, that's the main explanation for those three terms.
Yeah, so basically art, science, and sort of social kind of
Yeah.
social humanities. Okay, and then how, in terms of when you're designing projects, I'm curious to hear a little bit about that. How do you think about buildings and physical space, and how do you go through this process when you're putting this into the applications of your work?
So I personally like to think a lot about this idea of the balance. It depends. It varies widely per project, because an architect is never working alone. You have a team, and it's, yeah, of course, you have a team of architects and designers, but you also have a team of consultants that you have to work with, and you have a client, which at the end of the day is the one paying. So if the one making the decisions, or not making all the decisions, but pulling a lot of the triggers in the project. If you ask for my favorite, like in an ideal world, the each the process of starting the design of a building should always start with a very deep site and context analysis. And by site, I mean there's a lot of science there, because I mean the specific site where we're building, the site conditions, the soil, the weather, the potential natural elements that could impact the structure, the local materials that are available, um, the solar exposure. There's so many, but there's also the context. So who lives in this area? What are the people like? What do they need? What do they want? But this is where it also depends heavily on the client and the kind of project, because it varies a lot, whether it is a private residence or a hotel or a public oriented housing. I think the context is a very important aspect of it, and I think it should be always at the forefront of starting the project. Then, as we develop, then there comes the architect's concept, which is where the art comes in. And this is where I think the process starts narrowing down, where the architect's concept should go also hand in hand with the sciences, the science aspect of it, which again ties back to the context and the site, because the site sets a lot of the challenges to take into account when you're building. So it's a complicated wheel. Yeah, you have to sort of spin it a couple of times for sure. But I really think the context is extremely important. And the concept, the architect's theory, the concept, the art within the architecture should be very tied to both the context and the engineering and sciences within the building.
And then there's the social human the social it was social or humanities was the term for that final category.
Yeah, the social and humanities, which is basically the context, right?
Yes. Okay.
because but that's what I mean by context. You have the site, which is a physical site, and then the context, which is the social aspect of the site, the people who,
I see. Okay.
yeah.
Okay. Um, and so, in terms of, and this gets into, I don't know if we want to talk about design styles, and I know when we had spoken earlier, there's a definition of like a school of architecture versus a style of architecture, and kind of all of these. Can we, if you mind, go through those terms, like the term of what is, a style of architecture versus a school of architecture? Because I hear those terms quite a lot.
A style is basically just a visual language for architecture, right? For example, minimal architecture. We all know what that is. When we imagine maybe mostly white space or light colors, maybe a few accents, but it's again minimal. That's very visual. Or now it's very common, like the maximalist. Now it's very common too. So it was born, I think, recently as a reaction to minimalism, but it's not necessarily a movement. It's merely just an aesthetic choice, or like a visual language. Um, so that's the style, right? Um, School of architecture, or like some people have called them movements, are born more of a reaction. So, and they tie more to the art portion of architecture, let's say the artistic side of architecture, because it takes a lot more thought and sort of like creative experiment, and it usually is very, very social politically tied. It's a reaction to what's going on in the world. Every movement has been a reaction to what has gone on in the world, and then the styles kind of like tie onto those, of course. But a movement is, for example, modernism, which a lot of people identify as a style. So a lot of people say, "Oh, I want a modern style house." It just means they want a house that looks like a house that was made within the modernism movement, which was a reaction to what was going on in the world, the industrial era, this steel. But then we start learning how to mass produce things, how to work with steel and plaster, and everything is, and there's some ornaments in modernism. It doesn't mean that it's minimalist, which I think sometimes might be a confusion there, because sometimes people, I want a modern house, and in reality, sometimes when they say that, they mean a minimalistic house, a minimalistic style house, because a modern house is really, when you think of mid-century modern, that's like more modernism style looking house.
I'm actually curious because I've heard about minimalism, and I can imagine that in my mind, but I've heard the term maximalism more recently, but it's not something I've got a great sort of visual image to. And obviously, for this, since it's just us talking, we'll put reference images in. But could you give me a sense of not only maximalism as a style of architecture, but other forms of styles of architecture? So aside from the schools of architecture, like, are other than minimalism and maximalism, is there anything else?
There's so many. There's, for example, the industrial style. There is the brutalist style, which is, so the industrial, you can imagine, is mostly metallic, exposed, concrete mixed with metal, a bit rough looking, like maybe it was originally some sort of like factory, or you built something there, or like I mentioned brutalism, so it's more also concrete as a material, but also tends to be taller structures, less openings. A lot of people like it because of the less amount of openings allow you to actually control light in structures better when it's well done. Um, it, all the styles can be well done and can be horribly done. There's still that style. But I mean, there's a classical style, which doesn't mean that it's like, classic. It's not a movement. It was never like classical architecture movement. it was just a style that was taken on. And for example, a lot of the architecture that we see in right now, what I can think of, like everybody would know, is Monticello. Everybody thinks of Monticello, or a lot of the architecture around Washington D.C. That's classical architecture. It stems from Greek and Roman, but it obviously isn't Greek and Roman. It's just a classical style of building
I
architecture.
want to cut into history here for a second, but this raises an interesting question of how I've sort of tried to understand the idea of, because there are movements that I've thought of as like neoclassicalism, which would have been, you had sort of phases of, we're going to emulate Greek and Roman architecture in the 1600s and the 1700s and the 1800s and even in early 1900s, and that sort of keeps showing up. But that would be, so that's a style, that's
That's a
not a
style. That's not so
it's a style, that's not a school.
neoclassical.
Okay.
Exactly. So what you're bringing up is exactly right. Neoclassical is this style that came after the classical style. So there is the new trends in what was Western Europe architecture at that point. America was heavily influenced by them, so that was a neoclassical style. Not a movement though. It was not a reaction to anything. It was just people liked aesthetics. They put it on buildings. That's it. If you want to, for example, there is the mid-century style that I was talking about. It goes along with the movement, which is
Explain how the style. Can you explain how the style goes along with the movement?
so. Can you? So it's actually Art Deco. You know what Art Deco
Yeah,
style is?
I'm familiar with the Art Deco style.
Yeah. So Art Deco style is part of the mid-century modernist movement. The modernist movement.
Modernism, yeah, as a
Yeah,
concept.
exactly. But it's very ornamental to some extent, right? So it's what people think of modern in houses, and they think white Bauhaus, like thin steel windows. But there's also the same century people are also making really glitzy Art Deco architecture. So same movement, different styles.
Can we? I'm just, if you could humor me, I'd love to go through some of the major architectural movements
Mm-hmm.
of, let's say, the maybe like mid 19th century, sort of 19th
Okay.
century into the 20th century, and like the major movements that were shaping what we think of as structures, and then what some of those styles are that seemed also that kind of exist as a part of these movements, are sort of mixed in.
Thinking about movements themselves. So again, they're a reaction to something that's been going on in the world. So usually they take a little, longer to come around as a proper movement. For example, we haven't had a significant movement in a while, but or like a movement at all. Really, we haven't seen a clear movement in architecture in a while. But a very common movement that we talk about was when we went, for example, from modernism, which we were just talking about, to which is we're sort of like starting to know what like use all of these materials that we discovered, glass, plaster, blah blah, blah. And then we go into industrialism, which came with the like factory mass production, really the mass production era, where we're just like, okay, we're gonna make everything the same way, it's gonna be amazing. And then towards the end of the century, there's the postmodernism. So that postmodernism is born as a response to industrialism. They say, no, we don't like these industrial looking things that are mass produced. We're going to go more artsy again. And our reaction is more ornament, more colors, more clarity in aesthetics, very defined shapes, very colorful. And then, as a reaction to that, comes deconstructivism, which is
I've
now
never heard of deconstructivism. What is
no.
deconstructivism?
So
I've never heard of it.
it is actually towards the very end of the 20th century. And Zaha used to be the deconstructivist architect at first, towards the end of deconstructivism. But I don't know if you've seen the very early work of Zaha.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
she has a very famous painting or drawing. There are these straight lines that shoot across the page. They're colorful, but it's not defined. It's not defining the shape. It's not defining anything. It's deconstructing everything actually. And there is also her very first work that was built actually is here in not here, but it's across the border in Germany. It's very close to Basel. It's almost in Basel. It's a fire station,
Is
and
this
it
the Vitra fire station?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the constructivist work.
I see. Okay, and I'm trying, putting images in, and I'm visualizing kind of what that looks like, and it does, yeah, it doesn't have the same feeling of when I don't know, I'm not the biggest fan of postmodernism because I feel like sometimes you can just get these really just ridiculous things where people are creating stuff just because it's a statement to make,
Exactly.
and it doesn't have any longer sense of wait, why did we put a building here that looks like X?
Yeah, but if you think about it, it's a reaction of it's a reaction to the previous one. It's industrialism. Everything's functional. Everything's perfect. Everything has to fit within the factory line, right? And then postmodernism is like, no, we're better than that. We're artsy. We're gonna do whatever we want. And so it's sort of like a transition, let's say.
Bring up Zaha Hadid and the idea of what the sort of the research that I've done in a very basic layman sense, not as a professional, is the idea of kind of neo-futurism. You mentioned parametricism a little bit earlier, and I'm curious to talk. I'm curious about this idea of like modernism style, mid 20th century modernism, futurist style, whether that's and tell me if I'm using these terms correct, like futurism as a style can exist in buildings made in the 1930s, and it can also be a style in buildings made in like the 2010s, right? And then is there any concept of like I think of like traditional architecture, which isn't, I'm sure that's not like a technical term, but if I were imagining buildings that were constructed, let's say a typical traditional style in India or Japan or in northern Europe prior to like 1850 or 1800, that category, I'm curious how that's sort of defined, the notion of architecture as it's not all of history, but sort of a style of building that we broadly associate with a traditional culture from a certain part of the world, if there's a term or a concept for that.
Yes, actually, they're mostly made up names. Huh? I have to say, I mean, if you think about it, everything's made up names in reality.
Of
But
course, yeah.
there, a lot of people just say like Japanese style, and some people have come. I've heard different names for it. Like this, I find that again, it's a style that comes from that area. It's like with as the world has been more like getting more globalized and globalized, people have been more accepting and appreciative of other people's culture, and then we've started to bring more of the Asian architecture and arts to the West, which is something that had been hugely lacking in architecture for a long time. However, I don't think it's strong enough yet. Like we haven't studied it well enough in the West. And so we say it's mostly for interior design where people go like, oh, I want this Japanese style room or this like uh, Moorish or Arab feel hammam spa area. But in a lot of these cases, there's not much cultural study, at least in my experience. I wish to see more, and I love this. I love to explore these elements, and I would love to include more in my own work. Um, but in my experience, there hasn't been a lot of cultural studies done when we have brought this to Western architecture, and I think this is a bit of a problem in architecture. Still, it's a process of we're branching out and we're starting to study more Asian cultures and South Asian and Arab architecture, which is extremely rich. Architecture in the East is extremely rich when it comes to detail, to craftsmanship, but we just haven't fully, really like academically in the West. And of course, in practice, because if academia doesn't study it, practice studies it less. Um, it's very, very shallow for us, that architecture. So there's been a lot of terms that, yes, but it's mostly in interior design. And to me, they feel very detached because to look at a building and just build a random, not random, but like, a house that you like, let's say, with just your own style. And it's fine. You describe, it's your house. You describe to the architecture, to the interior designer, what you like. But to attach it to a culture without fully studying it, and to it's, I guess it's fine if it's what you like, but to like publicize it as like Japanese style, or like like Southeast Asian or South Asian style, it's a bit complicated.
I was actually also wondering the idea of just, let's say, irrespective of architecture, sort of modern stuff, and people saying, oh, I want a Japanese style front room. But
Yeah.
if we're actually just thinking about from a historical standpoint,
Mhm.
the form of traditional, let's say, Japanese construction,
Mhm.
form of traditional construction in China, would that be categorized? If we're just referring to that as a Ming Dynasty building from the 1400s, would we say that is like, it wouldn't be a school of architecture, right? Because it's just that.
It's just you can call it a style. A lot of people call it a style, but it's a style that we cannot replicate as Westerners
I see. Okay.
yet. Because we haven't studied, and by replicate I mean use their, unfortunately, because, and the other point that I wanted to make, actually, as you were asking me the question, when you said, like, when we come to traditional Chinese or Japanese architecture, the other huge problem that we have as Western architects, and I'm talking for the Western part of the work, is to some extent, I'm from the Westerner school. I have to try to learn a lot from the East. I love Japanese style. I love Korean style. I have worked in actually in a project in Korea, but not with traditional Korean architecture, traditional styles. And I would love to learn more, but unfortunately, it's something that the West is lacking.
But would all of that collectively could it be described as traditional, something like that, if you said, like, or, whatever, traditional Russian architecture,
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Built for in the 17, which even there you could get into schools of architecture. But with that idea of schools of architecture, so is there sort of a point in history where you can mark it out as saying, and let's keep it to the West here, we can say that schools of architecture are actually beginning to evolve, and that the people designing buildings are thinking about, we're building these styles of structures in response to the previous styles of structures that were put up, a generation or two ago.
Oh yeah, all the time, actually. But also, in response to what you were saying, like they skip it to the West. Actually, I wanna say this: the idea, the concept of a school of architecture is a very Western concept.
I was assuming it
Yeah,
was.
because it is more people architecture in the West. Something that I do know is architecture in the West was uh, was a gentleman's career.
Yeah, it makes sense.
You know what I mean by that? It was like you have to have a certain status to be able to learn it. Only men could do it at first. In the East, it was different. I don't want to get into how much different, but it was more people oriented, and it was more craftsmanship oriented, local materials oriented. So that's a difference. So the school came from the West, and it's a very Western idea.
When would we say? Because I'm thinking, like, I would imagine in the Middle Ages there isn't the concept of schools of architecture. There's obviously plenty of advanced stuff, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about how, everybody was like living in mud and stuff. Like, no, like, there's plenty of advanced stuff in the Middle Ages with Gothic cathedrals and all that. But I'm not on, my sense of the Middle Ages is people tend to not be as clinically organized with things in how they see the world as post kind of like Renaissance into the 1600s. And like, so I'm curious when the concept of, we are aware of schools of architecture being a thing that exists now, and that's how we are seeing our world. Like when is that like 1600s kind of when that's starting up?
I don't think so. I think, and I'm honestly, I'm not sure. I'm not fully sure about that. But if I were to say, and I'm pretty sure that it is a relatively new when it comes to like, I would say it starts in when the art movements start or also becoming schools. So, for example, we have Renaissance, and then it starts being a process of we start thinking of it as knowledge that has to be taught, right? Knowledge that has to be shared. When we start with these ideas of inventions, right? And then from there, it slowly starts moving, and then we arrive to the Beaux-Arts, the I would dare, I'm not fully sure, but I would dare think that this is probably the first school of architecture movement, the
How do you
Beaux-Arts in French.
how do
In
you spell
France,
that?
the Beaux-Arts is like the beautiful arts in French.
Oh, in English, I'm thinking, but in English we'd say bow arts.
Beaux-Arts, yeah.
Bow arts, yeah, bow, yeah.
Yeah.
Beaux, right?
Yes.
Yeah, in English it's just it's yeah, but in
Yeah.
English it would be bow arts.
But I would say that's the first time that we started looking as art in architecture as something that's knowledge to share and inventions to explore, right?
Okay, so that's nineteenth
Yeah.
century.
Well, actually, what I just said, it's a bit because before it was also knowledge to be sure, but it's not as much within the arts field.
It's yeah, it's not sort of oh, there's going to be you go to a university and there's courses that you take and you study. Yeah,
Right. It was more of a craftsmanship thing, like it's like being a sculptor, being an architect.
so late 19th century, so we have Beaux Arts, and that's anything else in sort of schools of architecture that are forming up pre when modern, pre modernism, right? So if there's Beaux Arts. Is there kind of anything else that would be a school, or is that the main one?
I would say that in terms of schools, when we say schools of architecture, there's not that many,
Okay,
because schools are also um, sort of have multiple styles, and some even there was a lot of sort of overlapping movements because architecture overlapped a lot with the arts around the Beaux-Arts, and then it became, for example, when it was Art Nouveau, the Art Nouveau movement. It was heavily artistic, but architecture took a huge part of it, and that's stuff like from Gaudi, for example, who's like not really fully Art Nouveau, but that's what I think of like really the idea of Art Nouveau.
the reason I'm also kind of curious about this idea of sort of we've got modernism, we have more of the traditional styles, we've got the different schools, we have the and there's sort of futuristic designs, which is another space I'm also curious about, like the futurism style and how that's kind of evolved over the last basically like 100 years. And getting I don't know if do you have any takes or even just your opinions on futurism as a style?
Yeah, I think there's you could say that there's always been someone that makes something futuristic, but I think there is something very strong about the futuristic architecture of today, or even the futuristic architecture that started with in the early 2000s with parametric architecture. And I would dare to say we haven't called this a movement. There hasn't been a real movement because it's not fully like I guess it's not social political enough. But I would dare say that it does come from a reaction to what's going on in the world, right? Whether it is fear or embracing um, this new like AI, like there's so many also innovations within the health world now, like, and there is this heightened idea of like social media, and we now can ask anything to ChatGPT. And where are we going with this? Is this going to be the kind of like sci-fi future that we have seen in movies. And I think architecture, the futuristic style architecture of today, some of it might be a reaction from it. Um, but this is purely just my my own thoughts.
Hey, that's fine. I mean, you're an architect. You're still allowed to
Um,
have your opinion about how you see the world.
yeah. But I think it could be a thing. But a lot of the futuristic, what we say futuristic style of today, also differs greatly when it comes to each architect's theoretical um, concept behind that building that we're calling futuristic. Um, and I think it's moving really fast. It's been progressing really fast in the sense of like we used to call Zaha Hadid very futuristic. Now nobody will call Zaha's buildings from that time futuristic as
What will
much.
they call it instead?
It's just like organically parametric architecture. But as architects, sometimes we have lost that sense of it's almost like a retrofuturism now.
I think
In
of retrofuturism as very sort of like 1920s, 30s futurism, and then like 50s, 1950s, 60s
which it is.
futurism.
But yeah.
Yeah,
No, Saha's futurism is still futurism, but it has the futuristic look in architecture of today has changed so much and has gotten sometimes such a deviation from from even parametricism because I think the reason why I say retro futurism is because when architects look at Zaha's buildings, parametric architecture is not as new anymore. Now every architect, at least every like academically inclined architect, knows parametricism very well. And so it's gotten I'm not saying this to diminish Saha's work by any means. Like her work is amazing because nobody else has managed to build some of the buildings that she has, which the curvature and the details and the intrinsical expertise in them as good. But today, when we look at the form of the building, which is sometimes a lot, we as architects sometimes we focus almost too much in this and the form of the building. Um, I think we think of Saha's buildings as a very like Grasshopper is this program where we do parametric architecture. This is where it came from, or like Maya, and we are now too familiar with it. So that's why we think of it as a little more retro. You know
I
what I
see.
mean? It's like when you get too familiar with something, you're like, okay, I've seen this.
It's interesting that it's the sense is that it's already moving so fast. I'm sort of as I'm kind of looking at things from sort of a regular layman's perspective. I don't see what appears to me to be as many groundbreaking structures as what sort of Zaha and her now that she's passed, right, her associates, what they're creating. It doesn't seem to be sort of this very I don't want to say common but sort of much more visible style of structure. They still feel like pretty unique art pieces that she's making, but if the sense is, oh, we've already moved past that.
And that's the other problem is because not as much as from an architecture point of perspective, academically, there's a lot of theory in buildings that are extremely futuristic that haven't been built yet, but we all know them. So, but since they haven't been built, most people don't know them.
So that makes sense. It's you have a multi-year. You're sort of seeing the future, no pun intended, multiple years ahead of everyone else in the general public.
I think, but I'm gonna give you an example of, and by the way, but for whatever's worth, because in reality, when I say it's moving fast, because our concepts are moving fast, I think the engineering and the budgets are not moving as fast because the world, it has to go with the politics and the economies of the world. So unfortunately, they don't move as fast. But when it comes to like seeing the future, I want to give you an example, and it's the fact that the Middle East right now, Saudi Arabia, but not just Saudi Arabia, is investing a lot in really like futuristic things, right? I'm sure you've heard of the line, for example. Uh,
Yes.
it's not
I'm
gonna.
laughing, but yes, I've heard of the line.
So, for example, this is something that I don't know if I would call necessarily like futuristic. It's very like controversial, rightfully so. And I don't think it's I don't know. I don't even know if it's going to happen. Definitely not going to happen the way they planned it at first, but not to get too much in it. But this ambition, whether it happens or not, their ambition has allowed architects to really think beyond what we actually can do. And I think this has been good for our field because if we're told you can do whatever, do something amazing, we'll pay you for it, then I would go crazy, you know. I would do. I probably wouldn't go as like strong looking futuristic as a lot of architects have gone, but I do. I of course every architect would love the opportunity to go really crazy with innovation and say like, okay, what if we could do this, and what if we could do that, and it's something that has never been done before. So that's what I mean by like it's moving really fast in theory.
Yeah, well, yeah. The in theory part is the key core. The little bit I hear about these are sort of these could very well end up being these kind of just perfect examples of humanity's hubris. These colossal mega projects that then just like somehow fall apart, and they're now just in the middle of the desert, and they stand as a testament to like what they thought they could build, and it's like no, they can't. But
Exactly.
we'll see.
Yeah. But I think academically it's good for architects. I don't know if it's good for the world. I don't know if it's good for the area. I don't know if it's culturally sensitive, but it's good for architects.
Okay. Actually, to that point about other people in the space and how we think about the space and the future for sort of versus traditional. One of the things that I've been seeing a little bit more on social media gaining some traction is a sort of push on a push back on kind of modernist and futurist designs in Europe, and people trying to push for more, to use the term, quote, traditional style buildings that are being kind of erected, where this used to be some modernist train station that was built in the 1960s because we had a beautiful Beaux Arts train station that was knocked down that was built in the 1880s, and now we want to rebuild something that looks like it was built in the 19th century. And I've seen this. I mean, it could be Poland, Sweden, the UK, Germany. It's a number of different places. The US, obviously culturally, it doesn't track the same way. But do you have any thoughts about that? Sort of people wanting to emulate sort of stop like pre 1900 style, or pre whatever 1915
Yeah.
styles.
I think again, I think it comes as a reaction, even though it's not a full movement. It also comes as a reaction of sometimes of if this group of architects maybe like let's say dreaming too far ahead and potentially failing in their dreams. Um, and failing to have something built. A reaction of that is like the fear of some other architects being like, we don't think this should be built. Instead, I think we should look back at the past and look at the past and learn from the past and now sort of like re bring to life the things that we have ignored or we have lost. Sometimes we think of it as like, look how beautiful, like Art Nouveau used to be, so like articulate and colorful, and now we've sort of stripped. Today's design is stripped from color. People tend to go for like beiges and like and sometimes a pop of color, but it's very common now. So that comes also as a reaction from that, right? It's like, let's be creative again. Let's make our own future without necessarily it being this like very ostentatious dream that it might fail. And also like what is it bringing, what's the experience, what we don't know, what's the experience we're going to have in that space that we're trying to build that looks cool from the rendering, but is it going to be comfortable? Is it going to be alienating? So again, it's like a back and forth push to styles that
It's weird because I guess it does technically count as contemporary architecture, which is sort of the little bit that I kind of was reading about contemporary architecture is how there's not, yeah, like there aren't these big schools of how we think about design well, sorry, I'm going to back up for a second. I realize there's another term, movements, architectural movements. So we've talked about styles, we've talked about schools. There's architectural movements. To back up for a second, can you take us through what an architectural movement is and how is that different than an architectural style or a school?
well, that's what I was trying to say earlier. The style, again, visual thing. It's what you through your you look at something, purely what goes through your eyes. It's all white, very few things, very few ornament. It's minimalist. Uh, um, Movement and okay, so maybe let's differentiate movement and schools. Movement is a social political reaction, and it's not just architectural, but it usually comes accompanied by the arts in general, which architecture is one.
Yeah, okay. Yes, that makes okay. That checks out.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Schools is it's this sort of like initiative, or like by architects and artists to decide to proliferate the movement in their personal styles. Like there might be multiple styles within a movement, but then a group of architects can be, I'm going to create my own school, and I'm going to try to teach this theoretical way of looking at architecture. And it hasn't been asked there hasn't been any like schools of architecture as widely recognized as schools as there was, for example, Frank Lloyd Wright's Prairie School. um, and it's not Frank Lloyd Wright's, but the Frank Lloyd Wright is it's the Prairie School.
Yeah. That sort of 1930s to 50s American
Exactly, yeah,
design style. Yeah.
yeah. But there hasn't been like recently, I guess, strong enough to be recognized. But I would dare to say the um, West Coast, in the U.S. West Coast, schools of architecture are, I think, close to developing its own school of thought in architecture and in the arts. I don't think
Which would be what?
that's the thing. They haven't fully defined it yet.
Oh, they're not there yet. Okay.
I don't think they're yet. They're there yet, but they have had so many voices. The West has had so many academical voices in architecture with a big impact in our field. We've had, of course, Tom Wiscombe. We've had Jimenez Lai. Um, we have Neil Denary. Um, I would dare to say also Tom Main is kind of like the earlier end of it, and Gary, I think it's like the very earlier, the beginning, towards the very beginning of it. And Tom Main, I think, has been a big driver. And there are some schools in the West, in the East, that have sort of like, added on to those ideals, but they're not fully defined. They're really not. These voices are not in mind, and they shouldn't be. I'm not saying they should be. So I think that's why we haven't said like, oh, the like I don't know whatever it would be called. Let's call it the West Coast school architecture. But I think there's a lot of theoretical thought coming from the West.
Take me through some of, and let's just pick one of these people, Tom Wiscombe. Take me through sort of, so who is this person, or who are any of these people, and how are they thinking about architecture?
Tom Wiscombe, first of all of these people that I've mentioned have been heavily involved in, except for I don't think Gary has been, but except for Gary, have been very very involved in academics. They have been or are instructors, and they are very they have been consistently voices and professors that architecture students really want to hear and really want to explore their ideas, whether they like them or not. At least this is my point of view. Um, Personally, I think there's a lot to learn from all of them. One thing that I feel like, for example, Tom Wiscombe and Jimenez Lai have in common is that and I don't think they're similar at all. And I think they both are very graphical, let's say, with their architecture. They're very form oriented. They think about architecture as objects, or they think, I'm trying to generalize it for both of them. Tom Wiscombe really thinks of architecture as an object, as independent, independent or like autonomous um, object. Jimenez, I think, is a bit different in his take, but it's also, if you look at his work, it's also very object oriented. Even though he is, I think, way more rooted in what is the West Coast later, like history and ideology and all of that.
And object oriented basically means you think about it as an object that is completely independent of anything else around it.
Exactly. So
Okay.
when I say object oriented is, and of course there's again a balance to find within all of this, but this would be basically the, let's call it the art. Remember we're talking about art sciences and
Yes.
yeah. And so this would be the art portion of architecture, and this is something that all of us as architects always do. We we make an object. We do. It's like our first thing. For me, the first thing is studying the context. Some architects don't care as much, and they just go straight for the object. But for me, the second thing is developing an object, which we call the massing. Right? It's what is our building going to look like? What shape should it have? Should it be informed by the site, or should it simply? I should just grab a piece of paper. I've been told. I'm pretty sure it's true that Gary designed buildings by Gary's like first thought of how to design buildings, or first thought of how to come up with massings was to grab a piece of paper, wrinkle it up, and put it on the table and look for a nice position for it, and then he would be like, "We should do something like this," So whatever it is an object. Whether you will put more thought of it on it when it comes to context or less, that is the object. So when I say object oriented, it's like, do we fully just explore this object as an independent entity, as a autonomous thing that, for example, Tom Wiscombe looks at his objects as things that belong to space, and we are part of that space, right? Because at the end of the day, we are part of this galaxy. So there is a lot to learn always on that too, because it's a very strong part of architecture. We cannot do architecture without an object.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So to bring sort of into broader picture kind of questions as we kind of get into the final stages here, the first one is like why bad buildings get put up. Now, I don't want to hit on postmodernism too much, which is sort of my, how I see it as my culprit. But what I've heard is that from the way you're describing this is that a lot of architects, they operate more according to sort of academic theories of how they're designing stuff. But from the, shall we say, the general public, layman's collective perspective, there's not a sense of, does this actually look good? If we're leaning into, say, the art, the artistic side of things. Do you have any thoughts on that? and we can define, good or bad, but if we can say, okay, we can collectively agree, at least some buildings, they don't look good, how do they get, put up?
Right.
And do you think it's subjective? Like, do you think good and bad is subjective to a certain degree, or it's more, objective?
I think it's depending on which aspect of architecture we're exploring, right? I think it can be subjective when we're talking about the way the building looks, because some people are really into industrial architecture. Some people really are into brutalist structures. So much so that they see beauty even in buildings that you can't get any light in a room on them. They find a concept for it and they value it, and that's not wrong. Like I might agree, I might disagree, but that's very subjective. Now, why do bad buildings get built? And I think when you end up balancing all of the aspects of architecture, I think there might be an objective way to tell whether a building is good or bad. Um, and I feel like these things are determined by mainly because I'm right now, I want to leave the subjective aspect of architecture out, to be a little less controversial.
That's fine. Yeah, no, we don't have to get controversial here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, a little less controversial. But like if we were to leave the aesthetic part of architecture, the arts portion of architecture, I think a building is objectively bad when, for example, it um, doesn't provide everything that it's supposed to provide. For example, when we have a building that it is objectively just not a good experience to be in, and just in the sense of like I don't want to sit in a dark room, but also in the sense of like I'm in a space and I have no idea how to get out of it because the narrative of the space is not clear. Like I don't know, I'm in a room and there's so many doors, they all look the same, there's no hierarchy, so there's no guidance for me to move towards one end or the other. There's so again, all of this could be considered subjective, uh, but at the end of the day, it comes a point where if you objectively sit in a space, a group of architects does, they can decide whether a building is working or not. There's spatial qualities. There is whether the environmental elements are being taken into account or not. Is it too hot? Is it a room that is it's in the middle of the desert and it's a glass room? You cannot sit in a glass. You cannot sit in a glass room in the middle of that. You'll cook. So there's these things that it's like objectively bad. Why did they get built? I think there's multiple reasons, and I would say that the main reason why these things get built are ego. That's it. It's somebody's ego to say that's what I want because either I'm paying for it or because I'm a famous architect and I know what I'm doing and you hired me to do this and this is going to be the thing. And people just can't stand it.
Yep, ego's a hell of a thing. It keeps coming up, and it drives so much stuff that I don't think put enough sort of value on. We're like the number of things that happen because of people's egos. It's a lot.
I think architecture suffers as a discipline suffers a lot from a problem of ego, I have to say, and it's almost a part of our career that we cannot seem to get rid of. And I think all of us are guilty of it at some point, maybe because of the competition, maybe because of because we love our career. And sometimes when we're given a sliver of hoping to explore and do whatever we want. Um, like the architecture we were talking before in Saudi Arabia, we really attached to it, and we're like, I want to do this because I'm me, and I want to be me.
Yeah. Any common questions or misconceptions you encounter from regular people about architecture? So anything that you want to set the record straight on? And then the final one is just how can regular people better think about, appreciate, look at architecture and try to find value in it in their lives.
Personally, I do want to set the record straight that I think it's very important, or like I think everybody should understand the fact that there are not good or bad styles. They're subjective, you might like it, you might not, but I do believe that it is important for everybody, not just architects, but also people in general, to be open to anything, to any style, because we can learn from a lot of styles, even the ones that we think are the most hideous. Like, you can personally think that any style or any it's the most hideous style.
Brutalism.
Brutalism, for example. I used to be, for example, I used to be so against brutalism. I used to see a brutalist building, and I used to be like, ugh, whoever thought of doing this? This was a reaction, a political reaction, like it came from an oppressive thought, and there's always something to learn. And I think it's this is a very important thing. This is a very important thing that we should understand to be able to really define our paths, or like our ideas on whether something is good or bad for us. But yeah, I think that would be my setting the record straight.
Yeah, that perfect. And then I guess just final thoughts on how people can better think about and appreciate the discipline, just from a regular person's perspective.
The way sometimes people fail to sort of see architecture for as more than just a building. To be honest, and I think for regular people to appreciate this, I don't think they necessarily have to put a specific amount of effort. They shouldn't have to. Just behind the thought of like focus on the kind of experience that the building or the city, because architecture also, when you put all of them together, they become an urban development, or whether it's from the 1500 or the 1500 or from tomorrow. And I think it's important, to look at if you want to fully appreciate architecture, to really think is look at the experience that the buildings bring you, inside and outside. And all of them put together, how does the light interact with them? I think the light really affects us, and sometimes it goes unperceived because we don't realize until we're suffering or we're like awed by it. But in reality, what I would need to say is like, you really don't need to pay more attention. If the architect did a good job, you'll be awed. Yeah, that's it. It is not
a great
really
way to think of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Obviously, where can we find you? If you have any social media handles, websites, projects, anything you want to kind of put out into the world of the internet.
I mean, I'm currently working on my own personal portfolio website, so it's not on yet.
Okay.
But
it might be up by the time this episode goes up.
Posted, because I'm actually actively working on it, because I've been participating in some competitions outside of my professional practice. So this is something that I would want to share and have a portfolio with my own work, my own beliefs. So when I finish that and I put it live, I'll let you know.
Thank you so much for coming on and talking about architecture. I learned a lot. I have a much better understanding now of like what all these terms mean and how how to think about stuff. So Daniela Aveguera, thank you so much for coming on Orbital Media, and for everyone else who made it this far to the end of the episode, I really appreciate you watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already done so, and we will see you next time.
Thanks for having me.